The city lights flickered like tiny stars on the wet pavement as Richard Caldwell stepped out of his sleek black car. The air smelled of freshly baked bread and roasted meat from the food stalls lining the street. It was a cool evening, and people bustled around, laughing and chatting as they enjoyed their meals. Richard wasn't like the others. He wasn't here for a casual meal or a night out. He was just passing through, waiting for his driver to return after parking the car. His sharp gray suit and polished shoes made him stand out among the crowd. Though he was a billionaire, he didn't like drawing attention to himself. Tonight, he wanted something simple, something quick. His eyes landed on a small food stall that had a line of customers. The vendor, a middle-aged man with a warm smile, handed out freshly made sandwiches, the aroma making Richard's stomach growl. Without a second thought, he stepped forward, ordered a sandwich, and took it from the vendor. The bread was golden brown, toasted to perfection, and stuffed with juicy meat and crisp lettuce. It looked delicious. Just as he raised it to his mouth, a sharp voice cut through the noise of the street. "Don't eat that." Richard's hand froze midair. He turned toward the voice, his brows furrowed in confusion. A small, ragged-looking boy stood a few feet away, his face pale with fear. His clothes were old and torn, his hair messy, and his thin arms clutched his stomach as if he hadn't eaten in days. His wide, frightened eyes were locked onto the sandwich in Richard's hand. People nearby turned to look. Some shook their heads, whispering among themselves. Others simply ignored the boy and continued eating. The vendor frowned and waved a hand dismissively. "Ignore him, sir," the vendor said, forcing a laugh. "He's just a troublemaker, always begging for food." Richard didn't move. Something about the boy's expression unsettled him. The fear in his eyes wasn't the kind of fear a child showed when he was just trying to get attention. It was real, deep, and urgent. Richard lowered the sandwich slowly. "Why not?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The boy swallowed hard. He glanced around, as if afraid someone might hear what he was about to say. Then, in a barely audible whisper, he said, "It's poisoned." A chill ran down Richard's spine. His first instinct was to dismiss it as nonsense. A homeless boy claiming food was poisoned? It sounded ridiculous. And yet, something about the way the boy said it made Richard hesitate. The vendor huffed in frustration. "Enough of this nonsense," he snapped. "Do you want the sandwich or not?" Richard didn't answer. His grip on the sandwich tightened. His gut told him there was more to this than just a boy causing trouble, and Richard Caldwell had never been one to ignore his instincts. For a moment, everything around Richard seemed to fade. The noise of the street, the people chatting, the vendor's frustrated sighs. All he could see was the boy standing in front of him, his small hands clenched into fists, his eyes filled with fear. Richard wasn't the kind of man who believed things easily. He built his billion-dollar empire on logic, not emotions. But something about the way this boy had shouted, the way he had begged him not to eat, made Richard uneasy. The vendor shook his head. "Sir, this boy is lying. He says anything to get food. Don't listen to him." Richard studied the boy carefully. His clothes were dirty, his face smudged with dust. But his eyes were sharp, desperate. "What do you mean, it's poisoned?" Richard asked, his voice calm. The boy hesitated. He bit his lip, glancing nervously at the vendor, then back at Richard. His hands trembled slightly. I just know," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, don't eat it." Richard frowned. The boy's answer wasn't convincing, but his fear was real. And Richard had learned long ago that sometimes instinct mattered more than logic. He turned the sandwich in his hand, eyeing it closely. It looked perfectly fine. Fresh, warm, normal. The vendor groaned. "Sir, if you don't want it, just give it back. I have paying customers waiting." Richard ignored him. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. His security guard, who was waiting a short distance away, answered immediately. "Take this sandwich and get it tested. Richard ordered, handing it over. The vendor let out an irritated laugh. "You can't be serious. It's just food." Richard didn't respond. He simply turned back to the boy. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated again, shifting from foot to foot. Finally, he muttered, "Ethan." "Ethan," Richard repeated, nodding. "Where are your parents?" Ethan's face darkened. His eyes darted to the ground, and he kicked at the dirt with his worn-out shoes. "Gone." Richard didn't push further. Instead, he took a deep breath and asked, "Have you seen this happen before?" Ethan's head snapped up. His lips parted slightly, as if he had said too much. He looked around again, as if making sure no one was listening. Then, in a low, shaky voice, he said, "People eat from here, and some of them never wake up." Richard felt a cold chill run down his spine. The vendor suddenly banged his fist on the counter. "Enough. Get lost, kid, before I call the cops." Ethan flinched and took a step back. Richard narrowed his eyes at the vendor. Something wasn't right, and he was going to find out what. Richard stood still, his mind racing. The people around him had already lost interest, returning to their meals and conversations. But he couldn't ignore what had just happened. Ethan's words echoed in his head. "People eat from here, and some of them never wake up." Was the boy lying? Was he just trying to scare him? Or was there something far more serious happening here? The vendor crossed his arms and sighed in frustration. "Sir, I don't have time for this nonsense. Either eat the sandwich or give it back. I have real customers." Richard glanced at Ethan, who was now staring at the ground, his shoulders tense. The boy looked ready to run. Something about that bothered Richard. If Ethan was lying, he would have been bold, maybe even smug about it. But he wasn't. He was scared, terrified. "Come with me," Richard said suddenly. Ethan's head jerked up. His eyes widened. "Do you what?" "I said, come with me," Richard repeated, his voice firm but calm. He turned to the vendor and handed him $100 bill. "For your trouble." The vendor's frown vanished instantly. His eyes lit up at the sight of the crisp bill. He snatched it and tucked it into his pocket. "Pleasure doing business," he said with a grin, as if the argument from earlier had never happened. Richard didn't waste another second. He placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder and led him away from the stall. The boy tensed at first, but didn't resist. They walked down the busy street in silence. The bright city lights flickered around them, and the smell of food lingered in the air. Richard stopped near a small cafe with outdoor seating. He pulled out a chair and gestured for Ethan to sit. Ethan hesitated but finally climbed into the chair. He still looked unsure, as if expecting to be yelled at or thrown out at any moment. A waiter approached, and Richard ordered 2 hot meals. When the plates arrived, Ethan just stared at the food. Steaming mashed potatoes, grilled chicken, and warm bread. His hands twitched slightly, as if he wanted to grab it but was too afraid to. "Go ahead," Richard said. Ethan looked at him, searching his face for any sign of a trick. When he found none, he quickly picked up the fork and started eating. He didn't just eat. He devoured the food like someone who hadn't eaten a real meal in days. Richard watched in silence. This boy had clearly been on the streets for a long time. But that wasn't what bothered him the most. It was the way he ate, fast, careful, as if someone might snatch the plate away from him at any moment. When Ethan finally slowed down, Richard leaned forward and asked, "Now, tell me the truth. What do you know about that food stall?" Ethan swallowed hard. He looked up, eyes filled with something Richard couldn't quite place. Fear. Pain. Then, in a quiet, shaky voice, he said, "I saw someone poison the food." Richard's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary lie. Something terrible was happening. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. He had expected Ethan to say something vague or make up a childish story, but his voice was too steady, too certain. "I saw someone poison the food." Those words were not something a child should say so calmly. He took a deep breath, keeping his expression neutral. "Who did you see?" he asked carefully. Ethan hesitated. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, as if holding on to something invisible. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, but then, after a long pause, he finally spoke. "It was a man. I've seen him before." Richard leaned in slightly. "Where?" Ethan glanced around, lowering his voice. "Near the alley behind the food stall. I sleep there sometimes." Richard frowned. He had assumed Ethan was just another homeless child struggling to survive, but now he realized the boy had seen more than he should have. "Tell me everything," he said firmly, his gaze steady. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. He pushed his empty plate aside and took a deep breath. "A few nights ago, I was trying to sleep behind that food stall. It was late, and most of the people had left. Then I saw this man. He was tall, wearing dark clothes. He walked up to the stall's storage area and took out some food containers." Richard listened intently, his fingers tapping against the table. And then, Ethan's eyes darkened. He pulled out a small bottle and poured something into the food. Richard's jaw tightened. "Did you see what was in the bottle?" Ethan shook his head. "No, but the next day, I saw a homeless man eat from that stall. And later, I heard he never woke up." A heavy silence settled between them. Richard's stomach clenched. If Ethan was telling the truth, then something much bigger was going on. He exhaled slowly, trying to make sense of it all. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked. Ethan gave a dry, bitter laugh. "Who would listen to me? I'm just a kid. People don't care about kids like me." Richard felt something shift inside him. He had spent years building his empire, surrounded by wealth and power, yet here was this child, alone, forgotten, surviving on scraps, and he had witnessed something terrible. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out and saw a message from his security guard. "Sandwich tested positive for toxic substances. This is serious." Richard's grip on the phone tightened. His instincts had been right. The food was poisoned. He looked back at Ethan, who was watching him carefully, waiting for his reaction. Richard leaned forward and spoke in a low, firm voice. "You're not alone in this anymore. I'm going to find out who's behind this." Ethan's eyes widened slightly, as if he wasn't sure whether to believe him. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar: hope. And Richard Caldwell had just made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Richard stared at the message on his phone, his heart pounding. The sandwich was poisoned. Ethan had been telling the truth all along. If the boy hadn't stopped him, he could have been another victim. He looked up at Ethan, who was watching him closely. There was something in the boy's eyes. Fear, yes, but also relief. It was as if, for once, someone finally believed him. Richard put his phone down and folded his hands on the table. "Ethan, I need you to tell me everything you remember about that man. Every detail." Ethan hesitated, rubbing his hands together. "I don't know much," he admitted, "but I've seen him before. He always comes late at night, when no one's around. He wears a black jacket, and he always looks around like he's checking if someone's watching." Richard nodded. "Have you ever heard him talk? Seen his face?" Ethan shook his head. "No, he always keeps his hood up. But," he frowned, as if trying to remember something, "he has a limp. When he walks, one of his legs drags a little." That was something. A small detail, but it could help. Richard's mind was already racing, thinking of what to do next. He couldn't let this go. Someone was poisoning food meant for the homeless, and no one had noticed until now. Just then, his security guard, David, walked up to the table, his face serious. He placed a small envelope in front of Richard. "The lab confirmed it," he said in a low voice. "The food had traces of a slow-acting poison. If you had eaten it, you wouldn't have noticed right away. But within a few hours," he trailed off, shaking his head. Richard clenched his jaw. And the vendor? David sighed. He doesn't seem to know anything. The poison wasn't in all the food, just certain portions. If Ethan hadn't warned you, you never would have suspected a thing. Richard glanced at Ethan again. The boy was sitting still, listening to every word. He wasn't just some scared kid. He had a sharp mind, and he had risked everything to speak up. Richard made a decision. He turned to David. I want to know everything about that food stall. Who owns it, who works there, and who's been hanging around at night. David nodded. I'm already on it. Ethan fidgeted in his chair. What are you going to do? Richard leaned forward. We're going to find the person responsible, and we're going to stop them. Ethan's eyes widened. He had never had anyone fight for him before, but as he looked at Richard, he felt something strange. Trust. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone, and neither of them knew it yet. But this was only the beginning. Richard sat in his office later that night, staring at the file David had just placed in front of him. The food stall's owner, Mark Grayson, had been running the business for over 10 years. On paper, everything seemed normal. He paid his taxes, had a valid food permit, and no past criminal record. But something didn't add up. David stood across the desk, arms crossed. I checked the surveillance cameras from nearby stores. Guess what? There's no footage of anyone suspicious going near the food stall at night. Richard frowned. That doesn't make sense. Ethan saw someone tampering with the food. David nodded. Exactly. So I dug deeper. Mark Grayson has a brother, Daniel Grayson. He's been in trouble before, arrested twice, but never convicted. And guess what else? Richard leaned forward. What? David pulled out a grainy photo and placed it on the desk. It showed a man in a dark hoodie, walking with a slight limp. This was taken a few streets away from the stall a week ago. Matches Ethan's description perfectly. Richard studied the image. So the food vendor isn't the one poisoning the food. His brother is. David nodded. It looks that way, but we don't know why. Richard exhaled, rubbing his chin. We need proof. Real proof. He paused, then looked up. Where's Ethan? David hesitated. Still at the guest house. He fell asleep after dinner. Poor kid must have been exhausted. Richard felt a strange sense of responsibility for the boy. He's been through enough. I don't want him involved in this anymore. Asterisk, asterisk. David smirked. I don't think you have a choice. That kid is smart. He wants to help. Richard sighed. He wasn't used to dealing with children, especially not ones like Ethan. Sharp, brave, and carrying more weight on his small shoulders than most adults. Just then, Richard's phone buzzed. A text message flashed on the screen. Unknown number. Stop asking questions. Stay away from the stall. This is your only warning. Richard's grip on the phone tightened. David peered at the screen and whistled. Well, that confirms it. Someone knows we're dating. Richard's eyes darkened. He wasn't a man who backed down. If someone thought they could scare him into silence, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Tomorrow, he said, standing up, we set a trap. I want to catch whoever is doing this red-handed. David grinned. I was hoping you'd say that. Neither of them noticed Ethan standing in the doorway, listening. His fists clenched as he made a silent decision. Richard wanted to keep him out of it, but Ethan had already made up his mind. The next evening, Richard and David arrived near the food stall just as the city lights flickered on. The air smelled of grilled meat and fried snacks, and people moved in and out of the street, chatting and laughing. Richard scanned the area. Are the cameras set up? He asked. David nodded. We have hidden cameras placed near the stall and in the alley behind it. If someone tries to tamper with the food tonight, we'll see it. Richard exhaled. Good. Now we wait. But just as he was about to step back, a small voice behind him made him freeze. I want to help. Richard turned sharply. Ethan stood there, his face determined. He had changed into clean clothes, ones Richard had given him earlier. His messy hair still made him look like a street kid, but there was something different about him now. Richard sighed. "Ethan, this is dangerous. I told you to stay out of it." Ethan shook his head. "I know how to move without being seen. I can watch from the alley." David chuckled. "The kid's got a point. He's small, quick, and knows these streets better than we do." Richard hesitated, then finally nodded. "All right, but you stay in the shadows. If anything goes wrong, you run." "Understood." Ethan nodded quickly. "I promise." With that, the plan was set. As the night deepened, the food stall stayed busy. Customers lined up, ordering sandwiches and drinks. Mark Grayson, the vendor, worked quickly, flipping bread and wrapping food in paper. He had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. Then, just past midnight, movement in the alley caught Richard's attention. A hooded figure limped toward the back of the food stall, just as Ethan had described. David's voice came through the earpiece. "That's him, Daniel Grayson." Richard watched as Daniel carefully looked around before pulling out a small bottle from his jacket. He unscrewed the cap and leaned toward the food storage. This was it. Richard signaled to David. "Now." Before Daniel could pour the liquid, a bright flashlight beamed into his face. "Step away from the food." David's voice rang out. Daniel spun around, startled. His eyes darted between Richard, David, and the other security guards stepping out from the shadows. He turned to run. But suddenly, a small figure jumped in front of him. "Ethan." Daniel skidded to a stop, eyes widening. "You." Ethan glared at him. "I saw you do it before. You poisoned the food." Daniel growled, stepping forward. "You should have kept your mouth shut, kid." But before he could take another step, Richard grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back. "You're done." Daniel struggled, but David and two guards pinned him down. The poison bottle fell from his grip, rolling onto the pavement. They had caught him, and the truth was finally about to come out. Daniel struggled, but Richard's grip was strong. David and the security guards held him down while Ethan stood nearby, watching with wide eyes. The poison bottle lay on the ground, the final proof of Daniel's crime. Mark Grayson, the food vendor, rushed out from the stall, confusion on his face. "What's going on?" Richard turned to him, his voice firm. "Your brother has been poisoning your food." Mark's face went pale. "What? No, that's not possible." He looked at Daniel, shaking his head. "Tell them it's not true." Daniel didn't speak. His jaw clenched, his eyes darting around as if searching for a way to escape. Richard motioned to one of his guards, who picked up the poison bottle. This was in his hand. He was about to put it in the food storage. Mark stumbled back, his expression full of shock. "Daniel, why? Why would you do something like this?" Daniel finally spoke, his voice bitter. "Because no one cares about people like me." He laughed coldly. "You had your little business, making money while I had nothing. I wanted people to see what it's like to suffer." Mark's hands trembled. "You could have just asked for help." Daniel scoffed. "Help? You wouldn't have given me anything." Richard stepped forward. "So you decided to hurt innocent people instead." His voice was sharp, his anger controlled but clear. "People who already had nothing. People like Ethan." At the mention of Ethan's name, Daniel's gaze shifted to the boy. Ethan stood tall, his small hands clenched into fists. "You let a man die," Ethan said quietly. "I saw it happen." For a moment, Daniel's expression faltered. Guilt flickered in his eyes, but it was too late. The sound of police sirens filled the air. Within minutes, officers arrived and took Daniel into custody. As they led him away, Mark stood frozen, his eyes wet with unused tears. Richard placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. "I know this is hard, but you needed to know the truth." Mark nodded weakly. "Thank you for stopping him." Ethan watched as Daniel disappeared into the police car. He felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. He had stopped something terrible from happening, but he also knew Daniel had been lost long before this night. Richard turned to Ethan and crouched down. "You were brave tonight." Ethan shrugged. "I just did what I had to do." Richard smiled. "That's what real courage is." He stood up and glanced at David. "Let's go." As they walked away, Ethan hesitated. "Where am I going to go now?" Richard looked at him for a long moment, then made a decision. "With me." Ethan's eyes widened. "Really?" Richard nodded. "You saved my life, Ethan. Now, let me help you start yours." For the first time in years, Ethan felt safe. And for the first time in his life, he had a place to call home.